The highway at 2 a.m. is a different world. One where the darkness swallows everything beyond your headlights, and the only sound is the rumble of your engine cutting through the silence. For truckers who spend their nights navigating these forgotten stretches of America, the road holds secrets that most people will never encounter. Tonight, we're sharing 11 disturbing stories from drivers who witness things that still haunt them years later. Encounters with predators lurking at rest stops, phantom vehicles that shouldn't exist, and cargo that was never meant to be moved. If you're ready to discover what really happens when the sun goes down and the road gets lonely, make sure to subscribe to Verified Fears and hit that notification bell. Because these stories will change how you think about truck stops forever. Let's dive into our first terrifying encounter. My name is Colt, and I've been driving truck for 28 years. In all that time, I've seen plenty of weird stuff on the road. Drunk drivers, UFO nuts, lot lizards, you name it. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened to me on Interstate 40 last winter. It was one of those experiences that makes you question everything you thought you knew about safety on the road. I was hauling a load of electronics from Phoenix to Albuquerque. Nothing special, just another routine run I'd done hundreds of times before. The weather was clear, traffic was light, and I was making good time. It was around 10 p.m. when I decided to flip on the CB Radio, channel 19, just to see if there was any chatter about road conditions ahead. That's when I heard this voice, smooth, friendly, almost too polite for a trucker. "Good evening, driver," the voice said. "Beautiful night for a run, isn't it?" I keyed up my mic. "Sure is, good buddy. You heading east or west?" "Oh, I'm going your direction," he replied. "Nice Peterbilt you're driving there. Red cab, chrome stacks, a real beauty." Now, that caught my attention. Plenty of truckers drive Peterbilts, but mine was a specific shade of red, almost burgundy, and not that common. I looked around in my mirrors, but didn't see any other trucks close enough to get a good look at mine. The nearest headlights were maybe half a mile back. "Thanks," I said. "You got sharp eyes in the dark. Where you at?" "Oh, I'm closer than you think, Colt." My blood ran cold. I hadn't told him my name. I hadn't said my handle, my company name, nothing. Just keyed up and talked about the weather. I grabbed my CB handset so hard my knuckles went white. "How do you know my name?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The voice chuckled, low and amused. "I know a lot about you, Colt Matthews. 48 years old, divorced, 2 kids, Jessica and Michael. Jessica's 16 now, isn't she? Pretty girl, looks just like her mother. Michael's 14, plays baseball for Roosevelt Middle School." I nearly swerved off the road. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the wheel straight. Nobody, and I mean nobody, should have known those details. My kids lived with my ex-wife in Tucson, and I was careful about keeping my personal life separate from the road. I'd made plenty of enemies over the years, guys I'd cut off, dispatchers I'd argued with, customers who didn't like my attitude. But this was different. This was personal. "Who the hell is this?" I demanded into the mic. "Just a friend, Colt. A friend who's been watching you for a while now. You're carrying a load of Samsung televisions and computer monitors. Bill of lading number 447B891. Picked it up at the Phoenix Distribution Center at 2:47 p.m. Should be in Albuquerque by morning, if you keep your current pace." My mouth went dry. That information was in my logbook, sitting right there on my dashboard. But there was no way anyone could see it from another vehicle. I started checking my mirrors obsessively, looking for anyone following me. But the highway was practically empty. Just a few cars scattered here and there, none close enough to matter. "What do you want?" I asked. I want to talk, Colt. It gets lonely out here on the road. You know how it is. Divorced guy like yourself probably doesn't get to see his kids much. Bet they think daddy's never around when they need him. Bet Jessica's starting to date boys now, and you're not there to scare them off. That hit me like a punch in the gut. My daughter had just started her first serious relationship, and it was killing me that I couldn't be there to meet the kid, to do the whole protective father routine. It was one of the hardest parts about this job, missing out on my kids' lives while I was out here making money to support them. You don't know anything about my family, I said, but my voice cracked. I know your ex-wife, Linda, still lives at 1247 Cactus Drive in Tucson. I know she works at the urgent care clinic on Speedway Boulevard. I know she drops Jessica off at school every morning at 7:30 and picks up Michael from baseball practice on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I know a lot of things, Colt. I was sweating now, despite the cold desert air outside. This wasn't just some random psycho with a CB radio. This was someone who had been watching my family, learning their routines, their schedules. I thought about pulling over and calling the police, but what would I tell them? Some guy on the CB knows my name and where my kids go to school. They'd think I was nuts. I'm calling the cops, I said into the mic. The voice laughed again. Go ahead, Colt. Tell them a trucker on Channel 19 is being mean to you. See how far that gets you. Besides, you're in the middle of nowhere. Nearest police station is 40 miles ahead in Gallup. By the time they get to you, our conversation will be over. I tried changing channels, but everywhere I went, there he was. Channel 17, Channel 21, even the emergency channel. His voice followed me like a ghost, always calm, always friendly, always threatening without directly threatening anything. You know what I like about truckers, Colt? You guys are creatures of habit. Same routes, same truck stops, same schedules. Makes you predictable. Makes you easy to follow. That's when it hit me. He said he'd been watching me for a while. This wasn't a random encounter. This was planned. How long? I asked. How long what? How long have you been following me? 3 weeks, give or take. Phoenix to El Paso. El Paso to Oklahoma City. Oklahoma City to Denver. Denver back to Phoenix. You're like clockwork, Colt. Every Tuesday, same route. Every Thursday, different route. Weekends home in Tucson when you can manage it. My blood turned to ice water. He was right. Those were my exact routes for the past month. I'd been driving the same patterns, stopping at the same truck stops, eating at the same diners. And somewhere along the way, this lunatic had started following me, learning my habits, probably taking pictures. I floored the accelerator, pushing my rig up to 80 mph. If he was following me, maybe I could outrun him, or at least get to the next truck stop where there would be other people around. But the voice just kept coming through the radio, calm as ever. Speeding won't help, Colt. I'm not behind you anymore. What do you mean? Check your passenger mirror. I looked over at my right side mirror and felt my heart stop. There was a dark pickup truck pacing me, maybe 50 yards away. Keeping perfect speed with my rig, the windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside, but I knew that was him. Had to be. Wave hello, Colt. I jerked my head away from the mirror like it was on fire. This was insane. This guy had been playing games with me for miles, staying just far enough away that I wouldn't notice him, then moving up when he was ready to reveal himself. What do you want from me? I asked again. I want you to understand something, Colt. I want you to understand how easy it would be. How easy it would be for me to follow Linda home from work. How easy it would be for me to wait outside Jessica's school. how easy it would be for me to show up at Michael's baseball game. I want you to understand that there's nowhere you can go, nowhere they can go, that I can't find you. I was losing it. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely steer, and I was crying, actually crying, for the first time since my divorce. This wasn't just about me anymore. This psycho was threatening my kids, my ex-wife, everyone I cared about. "Please," I said into the mic. "Please just leave them alone. Whatever you want, I'll do it. Just don't hurt my family." I don't want to hurt anyone, Colt. I just want you to remember this conversation. I want you to remember that I can find you anywhere, anytime. I want you to remember that your family is never really safe, because I know where they are. The pickup truck suddenly accelerated and shot past me, disappearing into the darkness ahead. I tried to get a look at the license plate, but it was too dark and he was moving too fast. Within seconds, he was gone, leaving me alone on the highway with nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the rumble of my engine. I drove straight through to Albuquerque without stopping, delivered my load, and immediately drove back to Tucson. I spent the next week parked outside my kids' schools, watching for any sign of that dark pickup truck. I hired a private investigator to check if anyone had been asking questions about my family. I even considered quitting trucking altogether and finding work closer to home. The worst part is, I never found out who he was or what he really wanted. The CB radio stalking stopped as suddenly as it started. No more mysterious voices, no more threats, no more dark pickup trucks in my mirrors. But I never felt safe again. Every time I key up my CB radio, every time I see headlights in my mirror, every time my phone rings with news about my kids, I remember that voice and wonder if he's still out there, still watching, still waiting for the right moment to make good on his threats. That was 8 months ago, and I still jump every time someone uses my name on the CB. Because once you've had someone invade your life like that, once you've realized how vulnerable you really are out here on the road, you never really feel safe again. The highway's a big place, but it's not big enough to hide from someone who really wants to find you. My name is Ophelia, and I've been driving truck for 12 years now. Before that, I did 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Army, so I thought I'd seen everything. Combat zones, IEDs, losing friends. I figured nothing on American highways could shock me anymore. I was wrong. Dead wrong. What happened to me on a mountain pass in Montana last February changed everything I thought I knew about what's possible in this world. I was hauling medical supplies from Seattle to Billings, running behind schedule because of equipment delays at the loading dock. The weather forecast called for snow, but nothing too serious, just light flurries that shouldn't affect driving conditions. I'd driven through plenty worse during my years on the road. What I didn't expect was for that light snow to turn into a full-blown blizzard somewhere around Glacier National Park. The wind was howling so hard it was rocking my rig, and the snow was coming down so thick I could barely see 50 feet ahead. I'd slowed down to maybe 30 miles per hour, which was probably still too fast. But I had a delivery deadline, and medical supplies don't wait for perfect weather. That's when I saw him, an old man standing on the side of the highway, thumb out, looking like he'd freeze to death within minutes. Now, company policy was strict about hitchhikers. Never pick them up, no exceptions. Too much liability, too many horror stories about drivers getting robbed or worse. But this wasn't some sketchy drifter looking for a free ride. This was an elderly man, probably in his 70s, wearing nothing but a thin jacket and jeans. The temperature was dropping fast, and the next town wasn't for another 40 miles. Leaving him there would have been a death sentence. I pulled over and rolled down my window. The wind nearly knocked me backward. "Get in," I shouted over the storm. "You'll freeze to death out here." He shuffled over to the passenger side, moving slowly like old people do, and climbed up into the cab. He was shivering so hard his teeth were chattering, and his lips had that blue tinge that meant hypothermia wasn't far away. I cranked up the heat and grabbed a blanket from my sleeper berth. "Thank you," he said, his voice weak and shaky. "I thought I was done for out there." "What the hell were you doing walking in this weather?" I asked, getting the truck back up to speed. "There's nothing out here for miles." "Car broke down about 10 miles back," he said, pulling the blanket tight around his shoulders. "Phone's dead. No way to call for help. Been walking for hours." That made sense. Plenty of older vehicles couldn't handle mountain weather, and cell service was spotty at best in this area. I felt good about my decision to pick him up. In the military, we had a saying, "You never leave anyone behind." This seemed like the same principle. "I'm Ophelia," I said, trying to make conversation and keep us both calm while I navigated the worsening conditions. "Harold," he replied. "Harold Kozlowski. Been living in these mountains for 37 years. 37 years? Must know these roads pretty well then." He turned to look at me, and for the first time, I got a good look at his face. His eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and there was something about the way he stared that made me uncomfortable. Not angry or threatening, just intense, like he was studying me. "I know a lot of things," he said, "like how you got that scar on your neck." I instinctively touched the small scar just below my jawline. It was barely visible, unless you knew where to look, hidden mostly by hair and makeup when I bothered to wear any. I'd gotten it in Kandahar when shrapnel from a roadside bomb had grazed me. 3 inches to the left, and it would have taken my head off. "Lucky guess," I said, but my voice didn't sound as steady as I wanted it to. "Afghanistan, right? Second tour. You were driving convoy security when that IED went off outside Kandahar province. March 15th, 2018. You still have nightmares about it." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. The date was right. The location was right. Even the details about convoy security were accurate. But there was no way some random old man in Montana could know any of that. My military service wasn't exactly classified, but it wasn't something I talked about either, especially not the details about specific missions or dates. "How do you know that?" I asked. Harold smiled, but it wasn't a comforting expression. It was too wide, showing too many teeth, and it didn't reach those pale eyes. "I told you. I know a lot of things. Like how you blame yourself for Sergeant Martinez getting killed. How you think if you'd been driving faster or taken a different route, he'd still be alive." My breath caught in my throat. Martinez had been in the vehicle behind mine when the bomb went off. I'd been the lead driver, responsible for route planning and timing. When the explosion happened, his truck took the worst of it. I'd carried his body back to base, and yeah, I blamed myself. I still blamed myself. But I'd never told anyone that, not even the Army psychiatrists. "Stop," I said. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but stop." "It's not a game, Ophelia. It's just conversation. Like how you started drinking after you got back stateside. How you joined Alcoholics Anonymous, but quit after 6 meetings. How you became a trucker because you thought the isolation would help, but it just made everything worse." Every word was true. Every single detail was accurate. This stranger knew things about me that I'd never shared with anyone. Things I barely admitted to myself. My heart was pounding so hard, I could hear it over the wind and the engine noise. "Who are you?" I demanded. "I'm Harold," he said, still smiling that horrible smile. "Just a lonely old man who needs a ride. But I've been watching you, Ophelia. I've been watching you for a long time. I know how you sleep with your knife under your pillow. I know how you check all the locks twice before bed. I know how you wake up screaming sometimes, thinking you're back in that convoy. I wanted to pull over and throw him out, blizzard or no blizzard. But we were on a narrow mountain road with nowhere to stop safely. The snow was getting heavier, and visibility was down to maybe 20 feet. I was trapped in my own truck with this psychopath, and there was nothing I could do about it. I know about the pills too," Harold continued, his voice getting softer, more intimate. "The sleeping pills, the pain medication you steal from medical shipments. Just a few here and there, nothing anyone would notice. But I notice everything, Ophelia." That was it. That was the breaking point. Nobody knew about the pills. I'd been careful, taking only small amounts from large shipments, always different types. Never enough to trigger an inventory discrepancy. It was my deepest secret. The thing that would destroy my career and probably land me in prison if anyone found out. I slammed on the brakes, not caring about the ice or the narrow road. The truck skidded sideways before coming to a stop at an angle across both lanes. I grabbed the tire iron I kept behind my seat and turned to face Harold. "Get out," I said, my voice deadly calm. "Get out right now, or I'll beat you to death with this iron." But Harold wasn't there anymore. The passenger seat was empty. The blanket I'd given him was folded neatly on the seat, but there was no sign of the old man. The door was still closed and locked from the inside. The windows were fogged with condensation, but there were no handprints or signs that anyone had tried to open them. I stared at the empty seat, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. He'd been there 30 seconds ago. I'd been talking to him, listening to him tell me things no living person could possibly know. But now he was gone, like he'd never existed at all. I got out of the truck and walked around to the passenger side, checking for footprints in the snow. Nothing. The snow around my truck was undisturbed, except for my own tracks. I opened the passenger door and searched the cab, looking for any sign that someone had been there. The seat was cold, like no one had been sitting in it for hours. My hands were shaking as I climbed back into the driver's seat and got the truck moving again. I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, that the stress and the weather and the isolation had gotten to me. Maybe I'd been talking to myself for the past 20 minutes. Maybe the trauma from Afghanistan was finally catching up with me in ways I hadn't expected. But the blanket was still there, folded exactly the way Harold had left it. And when I looked at the passenger seat more closely, I could see the slight impression where someone had been sitting. The fabric was compressed in the exact shape of an elderly man's body. I drove the rest of the way to Billings in complete silence, not even turning on the radio. Every few minutes, I'd glance over at the passenger seat, half expecting to see Harold sitting there again, smiling that terrible smile and telling me more secrets about myself. But the seat stayed empty. The really disturbing part came later. When I was unloading at the hospital and one of the dock workers mentioned a local legend about Highway 2. Apparently, there had been stories for decades about an old man who appeared to drivers during bad weather, always needing a ride, always knowing things he shouldn't know. Some people claimed he was the ghost of a man who'd frozen to death on that same stretch of road back in the 1980s. Others said he was something else entirely, something that fed on fear and guilt and shame. I don't know what Harold was, and honestly, I don't want to know. All I know is that he knew things about me that no one should know. And when he disappeared from my truck, he took something with him. Some sense of safety I'd been holding on to. Some belief that the worst things in life were behind me. I still drive that route sometimes, and every time I do, I check my mirrors obsessively and keep both hands on the wheel. Because somewhere out there in those mountains, Harold is still waiting for the next driver who's foolish enough to stop. And next time, he might not disappear when the conversation gets uncomfortable. Next time, he might stick around to see how much fear and guilt one person can handle before they break completely. My name is Atticus, and I've only been trucking for about 14 months now. I know that doesn't sound like much compared to some of the old-timers who've been doing this for decades, but in that short time, I thought I'd gotten used to the weird side of life on the road. The strange people you meet at truck stops, the sketchy areas you have to drive through, the general sense that anything can happen out here in the middle of nowhere. But nothing prepared me for what I discovered at a truck stop in Louisiana that completely shattered my faith in humanity and made me realize just how naive I'd been about the darkness that exists in this world. I was hauling auto parts from Dallas to Jacksonville, my second cross-country run since getting my CDL. The company I worked for specialized in rush deliveries, so I was used to tight schedules and long hours. I'd been driving for almost 11 hours straight when I hit my mandatory rest period somewhere outside Shreveport. The truck stop I pulled into looked normal enough. A big travel center with plenty of parking, decent food, clean showers, and all the usual amenities truckers expect. It was around 2 a.m. when I parked in the back section where the overnight sleepers usually congregated. The place was busy but not packed. Maybe 30 or 40 trucks scattered across the lot. I noticed right away that there was a weird vibe among the drivers I passed walking to the main building. Nobody made eye contact. Nobody nodded or said hello like truckers usually do. Everyone seemed to be in a hurry to get wherever they were going, heads down, avoiding conversation. I grabbed a quick shower and bought some snacks, figuring I'd get a few hours of sleep before pushing on toward Mississippi. That's when I started noticing things that didn't add up. First, there were way more employees working the night shift than seemed necessary for the amount of business they were doing. Second, some of those employees kept disappearing for long periods, going out back behind the building where there shouldn't have been anything but dumpsters and loading docks. What really got my attention was overhearing a conversation between two drivers at the coffee station. One guy, an older trucker with a thick Southern accent, was talking quietly to a younger driver about staying away from the back lot and minding your own business if you want to keep driving this route. The younger guy looked nervous, kept glancing around like he was afraid someone might overhear them. I tried to approach them, thinking maybe they'd fill me in on whatever local situation I'd stumbled into. But they both clammed up the second they saw me coming. The older driver just shook his head and walked away, muttering something about rookie drivers not knowing when to keep their mouths shut. The younger guy followed him out, leaving me standing there confused and more curious than ever. Back in my sleeper berth, I couldn't get comfortable. Something about this place felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly was bothering me. I'd been to plenty of truck stops that had their own local dramas, territorial disputes between drivers, problems with lot lizards, occasional theft issues. But this felt different, more serious, more dangerous. Around 4 a.m., I was lying in my bunk when I heard voices outside my truck. Male voices, speaking in hushed tones, talking about the next delivery and keeping the schedule tight. That wasn't unusual. Truckers talk about deliveries all the time. But something about the way they were talking, the urgency in their voices, made me curious enough to peek out my curtain. 3 men were standing near a white panel van parked behind the main building. 2 were wearing the truck stop's employee uniforms, and the third was dressed like a driver, but didn't seem to have a rig anywhere nearby. They were unloading something from the van, boxes or containers of some kind, and carrying them toward a side door of the building that I hadn't noticed before. What made my blood run cold was the sound that came from one of those containers. It was muffled, but unmistakably human. A voice, maybe female, saying something that sounded like please or help. The men handling the container didn't react at all, like they were used to hearing those kinds of sounds. I grabbed my phone and tried to call 911, but there was no cell service. The truck stop was in one of those dead zones where the towers don't reach, which probably wasn't a coincidence. I considered starting up my rig and driving to the nearest town to find help. But by the time I got back with police, whatever was happening here would be long over. Instead, I did something stupid. I climbed out of my truck and tried to get closer to see what was really going on. I told myself I was just gathering information, that I'd document what I saw and report it to authorities once I got somewhere with phone service. But deep down, I think I already knew I was getting in over my head. I made it about halfway across the parking lot before I realized I wasn't alone. Another driver, a big guy in his 50s with arms like tree trunks, had started following me. He wasn't being subtle about it either, just walking directly behind me, matching my pace, getting closer with every step. "You lost, rookie?" he called out when I stopped and turned around. "Just stretching my legs," I said, trying to sound casual. "Long day on the road, you know how it is." "Yeah, I know how it is," he said, still approaching. "I also know when someone's sticking their nose where it don't belong. This ain't a good place for curiosity, son. Best thing you can do is get back in your truck and mind your own business." "I'm not causing any trouble," I said, backing toward my rig. "Just trying to get some air before I sleep." But he kept coming, and now I could see 2 more men emerging from behind the building. All 3 were converging on my position, and none of them looked friendly. I started running back toward my truck, fumbling for my keys, when I heard the first guy shout something about securing the area and making sure he doesn't leave. I made it to my cab and got the engine started just as the 3 men reached my truck. One of them grabbed the driver's side door handle, trying to pull it open, but I'd already hit the locks. Another one picked up a tire iron from somewhere and started banging on my window, spiderwebbing the glass. I threw the truck into gear and floored it, not caring about proper procedures or safety checks. The guy hanging onto my door handle had to let go or get dragged, and I nearly clipped the other 2 as I swung the rig around toward the exit. In my mirrors, I could see them running back toward the building, probably to alert the others that their security had been compromised. The truck stop employees didn't try to stop me at the exit, but I could see them watching as I pulled onto the highway. A few miles down the road, I found a spot with cell service and called 911. The operator seemed skeptical of my story, especially when I admitted I hadn't actually seen anyone being held against their will. Just heard suspicious sounds and witnessed suspicious behavior. The state police did eventually investigate, but by the time they got there, everything was back to normal. No sign of unusual activity, no containers or white vans, no evidence of anything illegal happening. The truck stop manager claimed I must have misunderstood what I'd seen, that they were just receiving a late delivery of supplies and some of the employees had been working overtime to get everything processed. But here's the thing. I did some research when I got home, looked into missing person reports along that stretch of highway. The numbers were staggering. Dozens of people had disappeared within a 50-mile radius of that truck stop over the past 5 years. Hitchhikers, runaway teenagers, people whose cars had broken down in the area. Most of the cases were never solved, written off as people who'd left voluntarily or met with accidents in the swamps and backwoods around Shreveport. I also found online forums where other truckers discussed that particular truck stop, always in vague terms, always with warnings to mind your own business and don't ask questions. Some drivers mentioned seeing things that didn't add up, hearing sounds that made them uncomfortable. But no one wanted to go on record with specifics. The general consensus seemed to be that as long as you kept your head down and didn't interfere, you'd be left alone. I never drove that route again. Told my dispatcher I wasn't comfortable with Louisiana runs. Took a different job with a company that kept me in the upper Midwest. But I think about that night all the time. Wonder how many people might still be alive if I'd been braver. If I'd found a way to document what was happening instead of just running away. The worst part is knowing that it's probably still going on. That truck stop is still operating, still serving as a waypoint for drivers traveling between Texas and the East Coast. And somewhere in those back rooms, behind that unmarked door I saw those men using, terrible things are probably happening to people whose disappearances will never be properly investigated. I learned something that night that I wish I could unlearn. That evil doesn't always hide in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. Sometimes it operates right out in the open, disguised as legitimate business, protected by isolation and the indifference of people who'd rather not get involved. And once you've seen it, once you know it exists, you can never really feel safe on the road again. My name is Caleb, and I've been driving these highways for 22 years. Growing up, my granddad used to tell me stories about ghosts on the road. Phantom headlights that would appear in your mirrors and vanish without explanation. Spectral truckers who'd warn you about dangers ahead. I always figured those were just old-timer tales, the kind of superstitions that develop when you spend too much time alone on dark highways. But after what happened to me on Interstate 80 in Nebraska 3 years ago, I'm not so sure those stories were just imagination anymore. I was running a load of agricultural equipment from Council Bluffs to North Platte. Nothing unusual about the route or the cargo. It was late October, one of those foggy autumn nights when the mist rolls in off the cornfields and turns everything ghostly and indistinct. Visibility was down to maybe 100 yards, forcing me to slow down to about 45 miles per hour. The radio was playing some late-night talk show about alien conspiracies, and I was half listening while keeping my eyes glued to the road ahead. Around 2:30 a.m., I noticed headlights in my mirrors. Another big rig, running about the same speed I was. Staying maybe a quarter-mile back. That wasn't unusual. Plenty of drivers prefer to follow someone else's taillights in heavy fog rather than risk missing an exit or running into construction. What was unusual was the truck itself. Even through the mist, I could tell it was old, really old. The headlights had that yellowish tint of sealed beam units from the 1970s, and the silhouette looked like a classic Peterbilt or Kenworth from that same era. I keyed up my CB radio on channel 19. "Hey there, driver behind me in the classic rig. You running vintage equipment or is that a restoration project?" No response. I tried a few more times, but the other driver never answered. That was odd, but not unheard of. Some old-school truckers didn't bother with CBs, and others just preferred to drive in silence. I figured maybe his radio was broken, or he was one of those antisocial types who didn't like to chat. But as the miles rolled by, I started noticing things that didn't add up. First, the truck never seemed to get any closer or fall any further behind, despite the fact that I was varying my speed constantly to deal with the changing fog conditions. Second, every time I looked in my mirrors, the truck appeared to be in exactly the same position relative to mine, like it was locked into that precise distance. Around mile marker 237, the fog started to thin out a little, giving me a better look at the vehicle behind me. What I saw made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. The truck was definitely from the 1970s, a Peterbilt 3559 with a long hood and classic proportions that they stopped making decades ago. But it wasn't a restoration. The paint was faded and weathered. The chrome was pitted with age, and there were rust spots visible along the cabin trailer. More disturbing was the driver. Even at that distance and in the poor visibility, I could make out the silhouette of a man behind the wheel. He was sitting unnaturally straight and still, hands positioned at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, never moving or shifting position like a real person would during a long drive. He looked more like a mannequin than a human being. I tried the CB radio again. "Driver in the old Pete, you copy?" Nothing. "Come on, buddy, I know you can hear me. Just want to make sure everything's okay back there." That's when something impossible happened. The truck flashed its headlights at me, not the quick double flash that drivers use to signal "okay" or "thank you," but a long, steady pattern that looked almost like Morse code. Flash, 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 long pause, flash, flash, long pause, flash, 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 flash. It repeated the pattern 3 times before stopping. I didn't know Morse code, but there was something urgent about those flashes, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I grabbed my smartphone and tried to look up Morse code translators, but there was no cell service out there in the middle of Nebraska farmland. All I could do was keep driving and hope that whatever the phantom trucker was trying to tell me wasn't too important. But around mile marker 244, I started to understand. The fog was lifting ahead of me, revealing a scene that made my blood run cold. There was a massive accident blocking both lanes of the highway. At least 6 vehicles, including 2 other big rigs, emergency lights flashing everywhere, state troopers directing traffic into a single lane that was barely wide enough for passenger cars, let alone an 18-wheeler carrying oversized farm equipment. I started braking immediately, but at 45 miles per hour with a heavy load, it takes time and distance to bring a rig to a complete stop. I was going to plow right into the back of that accident scene, probably killing myself and anyone unlucky enough to be standing in my path. There was nowhere to go. Concrete barriers on both sides, no shoulder wide enough for a truck, no escape route. That's when the phantom truck appeared beside me. Not behind me anymore, but directly alongside my cab, matching my speed perfectly. I looked over at the driver, and for the first time, I could see his face clearly. He was an older man, maybe in his 60s, wearing a flannel shirt and a baseball cap with some kind of trucking company logo I didn't recognize. His skin had a grayish pallor, and his eyes looked sunken and dark. But he was looking directly at me, and his lips were moving like he was trying to tell me something. I rolled down my window, thinking maybe I could hear him over the noise of our engines. What I heard instead was impossible. The sound of his voice coming through my CB radio, clear as day, even though I'd been trying to reach him for the past hour. "Follow me, son," the voice said, calm and authoritative. "Do exactly what I do, and don't hesitate for a second." The phantom truck suddenly veered hard to the right, heading straight for what looked like a solid concrete barrier. I thought he'd lost his mind. That desperation had made him suicidal. But at the last second, I saw what he'd seen. A maintenance opening in the barrier, just wide enough for a truck to squeeze through. It led to a service road that paralleled the highway, invisible from the main lanes, until you were right on top of it. I followed him through the gap, scraping my mirrors on both sides, but making it without major damage. The service road was rough and narrow, clearly not designed for big rigs, but it bypassed the entire accident scene and reconnected with the interstate about 2 miles ahead. By the time we merged back onto I-80, the phantom truck was already pulling away, accelerating into the distance like he had somewhere urgent to be. I tried the CB one more time. "Hey, driver in the old Pete, thank you. You saved my life back there." His voice came back immediately, but now it sounded distant and fading. "Just paying it forward, son. Same thing happened to me 37 years ago, right at that same spot. Difference is, nobody was there to warn me in time." The implications of what he was saying hit me like a physical blow. 37 years ago, the same location. I grabbed my phone as soon as I had cell service again and started searching for accident records on that stretch of I-80. What I found made my hands shake so badly, I had to pull over. October 15th, 1986. Multi-vehicle accident at mile marker 244 on Interstate 80 in Nebraska. Dense fog conditions. 7 fatalities, including Harold Hank Morrison, age 63. Driver of a 1978 Peterbilt 359 hauling agricultural equipment from Council Bluffs to North Platte. The accident report stated that Morrison's truck had plowed into the back of an earlier accident scene, unable to stop in time due to poor visibility and heavy cargo weight. The same route I'd been driving, the same cargo type, the same fog conditions, even the same mile marker where the phantom truck had saved me from meeting the exact same fate as Hank Morrison. I've driven that stretch of I-80 probably 50 times since that night, and I've never seen the phantom truck again. But other drivers have. I've heard stories on the CB radio, always the same basic details. An old Peterbilt appearing out of nowhere during dangerous conditions, warning drivers about hazards ahead, then vanishing once the danger has passed. Some drivers think it's just highway folklore, ghost stories truckers tell to pass the time. Others believe it's something more. I know what I saw that night. And I know that Hank Morrison saved my life 37 years after losing his own in the exact same spot. Some people might call that impossible, might say there's got to be a rational explanation for what I experienced. But I've spent enough time on these highways to know that not everything can be explained rationally. Sometimes the road shows you things that don't fit into normal categories of possible and impossible. What I do know is that every time I drive through Nebraska now, especially on foggy nights, I keep one eye on my mirrors and my CB radio tuned to channel 19. Because if Hank Morrison is still out there, still trying to prevent other drivers from meeting his fate, then maybe there are other phantom truckers on other stretches of highway, watching out for those of us who are still breathing. The road is a dangerous place, full of hazards that can kill you in an instant if you're not careful. But sometimes, if you're really lucky, the road looks out for you too. Sometimes the drivers who've gone before leave something behind, a presence that watches over the living and tries to keep us from making the same fatal mistakes they did. I don't know if that makes me superstitious or just realistic about the mysteries that exist out here on America's highways. All I know is that I owe my life to a ghost, and I'll never forget the sight of that old Peterbilt appearing beside me in the fog, or the calm voice on my radio telling me to follow him to safety. My name is Israel, and I've been hauling specialized cargo for 15 years. When I say specialized, I mean the kind of loads that most drivers won't touch. Hazardous materials, oversized equipment, government contracts that come with security clearances and non-disclosure agreements. I've transported everything from decommissioned nuclear components to prototype military vehicles, always with strict instructions about routes, timing, and who I'm allowed to talk to along the way. The pay is excellent, but there's a reason most truckers stick to regular freight. Some cargo comes with complications that go way beyond DOT regulations and weight limits. The job that changed everything started like any other high-security transport. I got the call on a Tuesday morning from my dispatcher, telling me to pick up a sealed container at a research facility outside Portland, Oregon. The destination was a government installation in Gainesville, Florida, a cross-country haul that would take me through some of the most isolated stretches of highway in America. The paperwork was minimal, just a bill of lading with a container number and delivery address. No description of contents, no special handling instructions, no weight specifications beyond standard container limits. That should have been my first red flag. In 15 years of hauling sensitive cargo, I'd never seen paperwork that vague. Usually there were pages of documentation, hazmat classifications, security protocols, emergency contact numbers, detailed routing instructions. This job had none of that. Just a pickup time, a delivery deadline, and a payment authorization that was 3 times my normal rate for a similar distance. The pickup location was even stranger. Instead of a normal loading dock or warehouse, I was directed to a fenced compound in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by forest and accessible only by a single dirt road. Armed security guards checked my ID and commercial license 3 times before allowing me through the gate. The container was already loaded on a trailer and ready to go, sealed with multiple locks and warning labels I didn't recognize. Don't open it. Don't inspect it. Don't even think about what might be inside. The facility supervisor told me as I completed the pickup paperwork. Your job is to deliver it intact and on schedule. Nothing else matters. I'd heard similar instructions before. So I didn't think much of it at the time. Government work always came with strict security protocols and dire warnings about maintaining confidentiality. I hooked up the trailer, completed my pre-trip inspection of everything except the sealed container itself, and headed east on Highway 84. The first sign that something was wrong came about 6 hours into the trip, somewhere in eastern Oregon. I was climbing through the Blue Mountains when I started hearing sounds from the trailer. Not mechanical noises like brake problems or tire issues, but something that sounded almost organic. A rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat, but loud enough that I could hear it over my engine noise and road sounds. I pulled over at the next rest area and walked around the trailer, listening carefully. The sounds were definitely coming from inside the container. And they weren't random vibrations caused by road conditions. There was a pattern to them, almost like communication. 3 short thumps, followed by 2 long ones, then silence for exactly 30 seconds before the pattern repeated. I tried to dismiss it as some kind of equipment malfunction. Maybe there was machinery inside the container that had activated during transport. Or pressure differentials were causing metal to expand and contract in unusual ways. But the sounds were too regular, too purposeful to be mechanical accidents. By the time I reached Boise, Idaho, the sounds had changed. Instead of rhythmic thumping, I was hearing what sounded like scratching. Long, deliberate scrapes against the inside walls of the container. Not frantic or random scratching like an animal trying to escape, but methodical, like something was carving patterns or symbols into the metal. I called my dispatcher from a truck stop payphone, not trusting cell towers for this kind of conversation. There's something wrong with the load, I told him. It's making noises, like there's something alive in there. You're imagining things, he replied, but his voice sounded tense. Finish the delivery and don't call me again unless there's an emergency. This feels like an emergency, I said, but he'd already hung up. That night, parked at a remote truck stop in Wyoming, the real nightmare began. I was lying in my sleeper berth when I felt the trailer rock slightly, like something large had shifted position inside the container. Then I heard a new sound, not thumping or scratching, but something that made my blood run cold. Whispering. It was definitely human voices. Multiple people speaking in hushed tones, but I couldn't make out the words. The voices had an urgent quality, like they were trying to communicate something important. Sometimes they seemed to be arguing with each other. Other times they sounded like they were pleading or begging. I climbed out of my bunk and crept back to the trailer, pressing my ear against the container walls. The whispering stopped immediately, like whatever was inside knew I was listening. Then, after about 30 seconds of silence, a single voice spoke clearly enough for me to understand. "Help us," it said. "Please help us." I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might have a heart attack. There were people inside that container, living, breathing human beings who were apparently being transported against their will. I was an unwitting participant in some kind of kidnapping or human trafficking operation. I grabbed my phone and tried to call 911, but there was no signal. The truck stop was in one of those dead zones where cellular coverage didn't reach. I considered driving to the nearest town to find help. But what would I tell the police? That I suspected my cargo might contain kidnapped people based on sounds I'd heard? And what if I was wrong? What if the voices were hallucinations brought on by stress and isolation? More importantly, what if the people who'd hired me found out I'd contacted law enforcement? The security measures at the pickup location, the armed guards, the excessive payment. This wasn't the kind of operation that tolerated interference from drivers who asked too many questions. I spent the rest of the night sitting in my cab, listening to the voices from the container. Sometimes they were quiet for hours at a time. Other times they became agitated, talking rapidly in languages I didn't recognize. But every few hours, that same clear voice would speak in English. "Help us. Please don't leave us here." By morning, I'd made my decision. I was going to complete the delivery as contracted, but I was also going to document everything I could and report it to authorities once I was safely away from whatever organization I'd gotten involved with. I took photos of the container's serial numbers and lock configurations, recorded audio samples of the voices on my phone, and made detailed notes about the pickup location and the people I'd dealt with there. The voices continued throughout the second day of driving, becoming more desperate as we got closer to Florida. Sometimes I could hear crying, sometimes angry shouting, sometimes just exhausted whimpers. The worst part was when children's voices joined the adults. Young kids asking where they were, when they could go home, why they were locked in the dark. By the time I reached the delivery location in Gainesville, I was a wreck. I hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a time. I'd lost my appetite completely, and I was jumping at every sound. The delivery facility looked similar to the pickup location, isolated, heavily guarded, designed to discourage questions and limit witness testimony. The unloading process was handled entirely by facility personnel. I wasn't allowed to participate or even observe closely. They moved the container using their own equipment, disappearing it into a windowless building that could have been a warehouse or laboratory or something worse. Your contract included a confidentiality clause. The facility supervisor reminded me as I completed the delivery paperwork. Everything you've seen and heard is classified. Discussing it with anyone would be a federal crime. I nodded and signed the papers, but inside I was already planning to contact the FBI as soon as I was far enough away to feel safe. Whatever I'd transported, whoever those people were, they deserved to be rescued. But when I tried to make that call 3 days later, I discovered something that shattered what remained of my sanity. The pickup location in Oregon didn't exist. The address led to an empty lot surrounded by forest, no buildings, no security fences, no sign that anything had ever been constructed there. The delivery facility in Florida was equally mysterious. According to public records, the address belonged to a defunct agricultural research station that had been abandoned for over a decade. I'd transported something that officially never happened between locations that officially didn't exist. The voices I'd heard, the people pleading for help, had vanished as completely as if they'd never been real at all. I quit the specialized transport business after that job and went back to hauling regular freight. But sometimes, late at night on empty highways, I still hear those voices. "Help us," they whisper from my empty trailer. "Please don't leave us here." And I wonder if I'm going insane, or if some cargo is so dangerous that it leaves permanent echoes in the minds of people foolish enough to transport it across America's highways. My name is Eliana, and I've been driving these highways for 24 years. In that time, I've learned to trust my instincts above everything else. When you're a woman in this business, you develop a sixth sense about dangerous situations, predatory behavior, and places where you shouldn't let your guard down. That instinct has kept me safe through countless encounters with creeps, perverts, and genuinely dangerous people who see a female trucker as an easy target. But nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered during a 3-week period last summer. A systematic hunting operation targeting drivers along one of the most heavily traveled trucking corridors in America. It started in late July when I was running my regular route from Chicago to Atlanta, hauling consumer electronics for a major retailer. I'd been driving the same route twice a week for almost 2 years, stopping at the same truck stops, eating at the same restaurants, building relationships with the staff and other regular drivers who traveled that corridor. It was as routine as this job gets, which is probably why I noticed immediately when things started feeling different. The first sign something was wrong came at a Flying J outside Nashville, where I'd been stopping for fuel and food for months. The night manager, a friendly guy named Pete, who always remembered my coffee order and asked about my family, seemed nervous and distracted. Instead of the usual small talk about weather and traffic conditions, he kept glancing toward the parking lot and cutting our conversation short. "You be careful out there tonight, Eliana," he said as I paid for my fuel. "A lot of weird stuff happening lately. Drivers going missing, police asking questions. Just watch yourself, okay?" I asked him what kind of weird stuff, but he just shook his head and moved on to the next customer. That wasn't like Pete at all. Usually he was happy to share whatever gossip or road information he'd picked up from other drivers. His reluctance to discuss details told me this was something serious. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to conversations at truck stops and on the CB radio. There were whispered discussions about missing drivers, unusual police activity, and recommendations to avoid certain stops after dark. Most of the missing drivers were apparently solo operators, independent truckers without the backing of major companies, people who might not be missed immediately if they disappeared. The pattern became clearer as I talked to more drivers. All the disappearances were happening along the same 200-mile stretch of highway between Nashville and Atlanta. All involved drivers who'd stopped for the night at specific truck stops, a cluster of 5 or 6 locations that were popular with long-haul drivers because of their amenities and competitive fuel prices. And all the missing drivers had been traveling alone. No team drivers or passengers who might serve as witnesses. I should have changed my route or at least started traveling with a partner. But I was stubborn and probably too confident in my ability to handle dangerous situations. I'd been taking care of myself on these roads for over 2 decades, and I wasn't about to let some unknown threat scare me away from my regular customers and familiar stops. Besides, I was curious. If someone was targeting truckers in my territory, I wanted to know who and why. My chance to find out came on a Thursday night in early August. I was parked at a TA truck stop outside Macon, Georgia, one of the locations that had been mentioned in connection with the missing drivers. It was around 11 p.m., and the parking lot was about half full. Busy enough that I shouldn't have felt isolated, but quiet enough that I could observe what was happening around me. I was doing my logbook paperwork when I noticed a man walking between the parked trucks, shining a flashlight into cabs and checking license plates. He wasn't dressed like truck stop security or law enforcement, just regular clothes, jeans, work shirt, baseball cap. But he was moving with purpose, like he was looking for something specific, or someone specific. I watched him work his way through the lot, spending extra time at trucks with single drivers, especially those parked in the darker areas away from the main building. When he approached a truck, he'd shine his light through the windows, check the doors to see if they were locked, and sometimes even try the handles. If the truck was occupied, he'd move on quickly. If it appeared empty, he'd spend more time examining it. When he started heading toward my section of the parking lot, I made sure all my doors were locked and grabbed the .38 revolver I kept in my glove box. I'd had a concealed carry permit for 15 years. And while I'd never had to use the gun in a threatening situation, I was prepared to, if necessary. The man reached my truck around midnight. I pretended to be asleep in my bunk, watching through a crack in my curtains as he examined my rig. He checked my license plate, shined his light through my cab windows, and tried both door handles. When he confirmed the doors were locked, he pulled out a cell phone and made a brief call, speaking too quietly for me to hear the conversation. After he walked away, I waited about 10 minutes before climbing into my driver's seat to see where he'd gone. He was standing near the fuel pumps, talking to another man who'd apparently just arrived. The second man was bigger, more intimidating, wearing all black and carrying what looked like a large duffel bag. They talked for a few minutes, pointing toward different trucks in the parking lot, before separating and heading in different directions. The first man continued his patrol of the truck parking area, while the second man disappeared behind the main building where the shower and laundry facilities were located. I grabbed my phone and tried to call 911, but like so many truck stops in rural areas, the cellular coverage was spotty at best. I could barely get a signal. And when I did connect, the call kept dropping before I could explain the situation to a dispatcher. I considered driving to find better cell coverage, but I was afraid that leaving might put other drivers at risk if these men were planning something for that night. Instead, I decided to try warning other drivers directly. I got on my CB radio and started broadcasting on Channel 19, the main trucking channel, trying to alert anyone else who might be parked at the truck stop. "Attention drivers at the TA in Macon," I said. "We've got suspicious activity in the parking lot. 2 men checking trucks, trying door handles, acting like they're casing targets. Everyone needs to stay alert and keep your doors locked." The response was immediate and encouraging. Several other drivers keyed up their radios to acknowledge my warning, and I could see lights coming on in cabs throughout the parking lot as drivers became aware of the potential threat. The increased activity and attention seemed to discourage the 2 men, who retreated to a pickup truck at the edge of the lot and drove away. But they came back an hour later with reinforcements. This time there were 4 men, and they were more organized in their approach. Instead of randomly checking trucks, they seemed to have specific targets in mind. They moved quickly and efficiently toward trucks that were parked in isolated areas, trucks whose drivers might not have heard my CB warning or might not have radios turned on. I watched them approach a sleeper cab parked at the far end of the lot, away from the main lights. The truck belonged to an older driver I'd seen around but didn't know personally. One of those quiet types who kept to himself and minded his own business. The men surrounded his truck, and I saw one of them produce what looked like a slim Jim or other lock-picking tool. That's when I made the decision that probably saved that driver's life and exposed a criminal operation that had been preying on truckers for months. I started up my engine, turned on all my lights, and drove straight toward the group of men, laying on my air horn and making as much noise as possible. The commotion woke up drivers throughout the parking lot and brought truck stop security running from the main building. The 4 men scattered, abandoning their tools and fleeing toward their vehicle. But in their haste to escape, one of them dropped a duffel bag that contained items that made my blood run cold. Zip ties, duct tape, syringes, and what appeared to be some kind of sedative medication. The police arrived within minutes, called by truck stop management once they realized what was happening. The investigation that followed revealed the scope of what I'd stumbled into. An organized group that had been targeting long-haul truckers for robbery, kidnapping, and worse. They'd use the isolated truck stop locations to identify vulnerable drivers, drug them if necessary, and either rob them on the spot or transport them to secondary locations for extended criminal activities. Most of the missing drivers I'd been hearing about were eventually found, though not all of them survived their encounters with this group. The men I'd observed were part of a larger network that had been operating along multiple trucking corridors throughout the Southeast, taking advantage of the transient nature of the trucking industry and the fact that missing drivers often aren't reported immediately. The trial lasted 8 months, and my testimony was crucial in convicting the men I'd witnessed that night. But the experience changed how I approach this job. I'm more cautious about where I stop, more paranoid about who's watching me, and more aware that predators specifically target truckers because they know we're often isolated and vulnerable. I still drive the same routes, but I travel differently now. I vary my stopping patterns, communicate regularly with other drivers, and never assume that a familiar truck stop is automatically safe. Because I learned that night in Macon that evil doesn't always hide in dark alleys. Sometimes it operates right out in the open, in well-lit parking lots where hundreds of people pass by every day, counting on the fact that most people would rather mind their own business than get involved in someone else's problems. The highway will always be dangerous for people who drive alone at night. But it's even more dangerous when that danger comes from organized predators who've learned to exploit the vulnerabilities of our industry. Staying safe out here isn't just about defensive driving and proper equipment maintenance. It's about staying alert to human threats that see truckers as easy targets in an environment where screams for help might go unheard. My name is Tobias, and I've been an independent trucker for 18 years. When you work for yourself instead of a big company, you learn to handle your own problems. Mechanical issues, routing difficulties, customer disputes. Self-reliance isn't just a virtue in this business, it's a necessity. But there are some situations where all the mechanical knowledge and street smarts in the world won't save you. Places where being self-reliant becomes a liability instead of an asset. I learned that lesson the hard way in a town that doesn't exist on any map, where the locals have their own ideas about hospitality and the meaning of community service. I was hauling a load of industrial machinery from Memphis to Birmingham, running a day behind schedule because of loading delays at the shipper. It was one of those Murphy's Law trips where everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Traffic jams, construction delays, a flat tire outside Little Rock that cost me 3 hours. By the time I hit the back roads of rural Tennessee, I was pushing hard to make up time, probably driving faster than I should have been on those winding mountain highways. That's when my engine started making a noise I'd never heard before. A grinding, metallic sound that seemed to be coming from deep in the motor. I've been working on trucks since I was 16 years old, started as a mechanic before I got my CDL, so I know the difference between minor problems and major catastrophes. This sound was definitely in the catastrophe category. I managed to nurse the rig another 5 miles before the engine seized completely, steam pouring from under the hood and warning lights flashing across my dashboard like a Christmas tree. I coasted to a stop on the shoulder of a 2-lane road that cut through dense forest, miles from the nearest town, according to my GPS. The silence after the engine died was absolute. No traffic, no aircraft, no sounds of civilization anywhere nearby. I popped the hood and confirmed what I already suspected: complete engine failure. The block was cracked, oil and coolant mixing together in a puddle beneath the truck. This wasn't something I could fix with roadside repairs. I needed a heavy-duty tow truck and a complete engine rebuild, which meant I was looking at weeks of downtime and repair costs that would probably bankrupt me. I tried calling my insurance company's roadside assistance, but my cell phone had no signal. The mountains and dense forest were blocking cellular towers, leaving me completely cut off from the outside world. My CB radio wasn't picking up any traffic either, just static and the occasional burst of what sounded like foreign language transmissions from somewhere far away. I was starting to consider my options. Hiking back to the last town I'd passed, flagging down other vehicles, maybe even abandoning the truck temporarily to find help, when I saw headlights approaching from behind. A pickup truck slowed down and pulled over, and a man in his 50s climbed out to see if I needed assistance. "Looks like you got some trouble there, friend," he said, examining the steam still rising from my engine compartment. "That's a blown motor if I ever saw one." I introduced myself and explained my situation. The man, who said his name was Earl, listened sympathetically and offered to help. "There's a town about 10 miles up the road," he said. "Millerville. Got a mechanic there who specializes in big trucks. I can give you a ride to talk to him about getting your rig towed in." I was grateful for the offer. Earl seemed like a decent guy, friendly, knowledgeable about trucks, willing to go out of his way to help a stranded driver. I grabbed my wallet and logbook from the cab and climbed into his pickup, figuring I could arrange for repairs and maybe find a motel room while I waited for parts to arrive. The 10-mile drive to Millerville took us deeper into the mountains, along roads that seemed to get narrower and more isolated with each mile. I started to feel uneasy when Earl turned off the main highway onto what looked like a logging road, explaining that it was a shortcut that would save us time. The trees pressed in on both sides, so thick and tall that they blocked out most of the daylight, even though it was only mid-afternoon. "You sure this is the right way?" I asked as we bounced along the rough dirt road. "Oh yeah, I've lived in these parts my whole life," Earl replied. "Know every road and trail for 50 miles. Don't worry, we'll have you sorted out in no time." But something about his tone had changed. The friendly, helpful demeanor was still there, but underneath it, I detected something else. Anticipation, maybe even excitement. Like he was looking forward to showing me something that I wasn't going to enjoy seeing. Millerville turned out to be exactly what you'd expect from a mountain town that time forgot. Maybe 30 buildings clustered around a single main street, most of them looking like they hadn't been painted or repaired in decades. There was a general store, a diner, a gas station with pumps that looked like they belonged in a museum, and what appeared to be a combination auto repair shop and junkyard. What struck me immediately was how many people were outside, despite the fact that it was the middle of a weekday. They were sitting on porches, standing in doorways, gathered in small groups on the sidewalks. And all of them were watching us with interest that seemed excessive for the arrival of a stranger needing mechanical help. Their stares were intense, calculating, like they were evaluating me for some purpose I couldn't understand. Earl parked in front of the repair shop and led me inside to meet the mechanic, a tall, thin man named Luther, who examined my description of the engine failure with professional interest. "Sounds like you need a complete rebuild," he said. "That's expensive work. Probably $8,000 to $10,000 once you figure in parts and labor." The price was devastating, but not unexpected for that level of engine damage. I asked about getting my truck towed to the shop and how long the repairs might take. Luther's answers were encouraging. He could have a tow truck at my location within a couple hours. Parts could be ordered and delivered within a few days. Total turnaround time maybe a week. "Of course, you'll need someplace to stay while we work on it," Luther said. "Diner down the street rents rooms upstairs. Nothing fancy, but clean and cheap." I thanked him and walked down to the diner to arrange accommodations. The woman behind the counter, who introduced herself as Martha, was friendly enough but asked a lot of questions about my background, my route, whether anyone was expecting me in Birmingham. When I mentioned that I was already running behind schedule and my customer would be wondering about the delay, she suggested that cell phone service was unreliable in the area, and I might have trouble contacting people until my truck was repaired and I could drive to somewhere with better coverage. That should have been another warning sign. But I was focused on practical concerns. Getting my truck fixed, minimizing my financial losses, getting back on the road as quickly as possible. I paid for a room for 3 nights and went back to meet the tow truck that Luther had promised to send. But the tow truck never came. When I went back to the repair shop to ask about the delay, Luther claimed there had been mechanical problems with his wrecker and it would be tomorrow before he could retrieve my rig. The same thing happened the next day, and the day after that. Always some excuse, always a promise that the truck would be picked up soon, always another delay that kept me stranded in Millerville. By the 4th day, I was starting to understand that the delays weren't accidental. Every time I tried to arrange alternative transportation or walk back to my truck, someone from town would intercept me with offers of help that somehow never materialized. When I asked about bus service or taxi companies that could take me to a larger town, I was told that such services didn't operate in the area. When I tried to hike out on foot, I was warned about dangerous wildlife and confusing trail systems that had caused other visitors to become lost. The truth became clear on my 5th night in town, when I overheard a conversation between Martha and Earl outside my window. They were discussing what to do with me, how long they could keep me there before people started looking for me, and what had happened to the last one who tried to leave against their wishes. I realized then that Millerville wasn't just a remote mountain town, it was a trap. The friendly offers of help, the mechanical delays, the lack of communication options were all designed to keep visitors from leaving. I didn't know what they ultimately planned to do with me, but I understood that finding out would probably be fatal. That night, I gathered my few possessions and slipped out of the diner through a back window. Instead of taking the main road that Earl had used to bring me to town, I headed into the forest, using my truck driving experience with GPS systems to maintain a general sense of direction toward where I thought the nearest major highway might be. I walked all night through dense woods, fighting through underbrush, crossing streams, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and Millerville before anyone discovered I was gone. By dawn, I was exhausted, scraped up from thorns and branches, and completely lost. But I could hear the distant sound of highway traffic. I eventually made it to Interstate 40 and flagged down a state trooper who helped me contact a legitimate towing company to retrieve my truck. When I tried to describe the location of Millerville and report what had happened to me there, the trooper looked at me like I was delusional. "There's no town called Millerville in this county," he said, checking his maps and GPS system. Nothing but national forest in that area. You sure you got the name right? I had the trooper drive me back to the area where I'd left my truck, following the same route Earl had taken 5 days earlier. But the logging road was gone. Where I remembered the turnoff being, there was nothing but unbroken forest. No tire tracks, no signs of recent human activity, no indication that anyone had driven through there in years. My truck was exactly where I'd left it, engine still seized. But there was something different about the scene. The oil and coolant puddle beneath the motor had been cleaned up, and there were fresh tool marks around the engine compartment, like someone had been working on it. When I tried to start it, the engine turned over immediately and ran perfectly, as if it had never been damaged at all. I've never been able to explain what happened to me in those mountains. The state police found no record of any town named Millerville, no evidence of the people I'd met, no trace of the logging road that had taken me there. But I know what I experienced, and I know that somewhere in the Tennessee mountains, there are people who prey on stranded travelers, who use offers of help to lure victims into situations they can't escape from. I still drive through that area sometimes, but I never stop for mechanical problems or accept help from locals. Because I learned that in some places, the most dangerous thing isn't engine failure or getting lost. It's trusting the wrong people when you're vulnerable and far from home. My name is Holden, and I've been trucking for 7 years now. I got into this business because I needed good money fast. My mom was diagnosed with cancer, and the medical bills were piling up faster than her insurance could cover them. The pay for long-haul trucking was decent, but the real money came from running tight schedules, taking loads that other drivers wouldn't touch because of impossible deadlines or difficult routes. I became one of those drivers who would say yes to anything if the price was right, even if it meant pushing legal driving limits and surviving on caffeine and willpower. The run that nearly broke my sanity started with a phone call at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. My dispatcher had an emergency load, medical equipment that needed to get from Sacramento to Miami in 72 hours. The distance was manageable, but the timeline was brutal. I'd have to drive almost non-stop, taking only the minimum required rest breaks to make the delivery deadline. The payment was triple my normal rate, enough to cover 3 months of my mom's treatment costs. I should have said no. Any experienced driver would have looked at that schedule and walked away. 72 hours to cross the entire country leaves no margin for traffic delays, weather problems, or mechanical issues. But I was desperate, and desperation makes you rationalize decisions that you know are dangerous. I picked up the load in Sacramento and immediately started pushing hard. My plan was to drive 11 hours straight, take a mandatory 10-hour break, then repeat the cycle until I reached Miami. It would require perfect conditions and flawless execution, but it was theoretically possible within DOT regulations. What I didn't account for was how quickly exhaustion would start affecting my judgment and perception. The first day went smoothly. I made it through California and most of Nevada without problems, averaging good time despite some construction delays around Reno. I felt confident and in control, convinced that I could handle the demanding schedule. But by the second day, crossing Utah and Colorado, I was already feeling the effects of insufficient sleep and constant stress. I'd been surviving on truck stop coffee, energy drinks, and maybe 4 hours of sleep per day. My eyes were burning, my hands were shaking slightly, and I was having trouble focusing on anything beyond the immediate task of keeping the truck between the lines. But the money was too good to quit, and my mom was counting on me to make this delivery happen. Somewhere in eastern Colorado, around hour 36 of the trip, things started getting weird. I began seeing things that weren't there. shadows moving in my peripheral vision, objects on the side of the road that disappeared when I looked directly at them. I knew these were hallucinations caused by sleep deprivation. But knowing something intellectually and dealing with it practically are two different things when you're fighting to stay awake at 70 miles per hour. The hallucinations got worse as I crossed into Kansas. I started seeing other vehicles that didn't exist, cars that would appear in my mirrors and then vanish, motorcycles that seemed to be pacing me but weren't really there. Sometimes I'd brake for obstacles in the road that turned out to be nothing more than shadows or road debris. I was becoming dangerous to myself and other drivers. But I was so focused on making the delivery deadline that I convinced myself I could power through until the next rest break. By the time I reached Oklahoma, I wasn't sure what was real anymore. The line between hallucination and reality had blurred to the point where I couldn't trust my own perceptions. I was having entire conversations with people who weren't in my truck, responding to CB radio calls that existed only in my exhausted mind, following GPS directions to destinations that didn't exist. The really terrifying part was that some of the hallucinations were interactive. I'd see hitchhikers on the side of the road and actually pull over to offer them rides, only to discover that no one was there. I'd stop at truck stops that appeared completely normal, until I tried to enter the building and found empty lots with no structures at all. I'd have detailed conversations with other drivers at fuel pumps, only to realize later that I'd been talking to myself while standing alone next to my truck. The worst episode happened around hour 50 of the trip, somewhere in Arkansas. I was convinced that my truck was being followed by a convoy of black SUVs with government license plates. The vehicles would appear and disappear in my mirrors, sometimes driving alongside me, sometimes forming roadblocks that forced me to take alternate routes. I became paranoid that my cargo was more than just medical equipment, that I'd somehow gotten involved in a covert operation that had attracted unwanted attention. I spent 2 hours driving through back roads in small towns, trying to lose the imaginary surveillance team. I made phone calls to my dispatcher demanding to know what kind of cargo I was really hauling, accusing him of lying to me about the nature of the load. I even considered abandoning the truck and fleeing on foot when the paranoia became overwhelming. It was only when I stopped at a rest area and found myself alone in the parking lot with no other vehicles in sight that I started to understand what was happening. The government SUVs, the surveillance operation, the conspiracy around my cargo, none of it was real. It was all the product of a mind that had been pushed beyond its limits by exhaustion and stimulants. But even understanding that I was hallucinating didn't make the episodes stop. If anything, they became more vivid and disturbing as I continued driving. I started seeing accident scenes that required me to stop and render aid. Overturned vehicles, injured people calling for help, emergency responders who needed my assistance. I'd pull over and run toward these scenes only to find empty highway with no signs of any accident. The most persistent hallucination was a little girl who appeared in my passenger seat somewhere in Tennessee. She looked maybe 8 years old, wearing a blue dress and carrying a stuffed animal. She claimed to be lost, said she needed help finding her parents, asked me to take her to the police station in the next town. I knew she wasn't real. I'd locked my truck when I took my last break, and there was no way a child could have gotten inside without me noticing. But she seemed so real, so frightened and helpless, that I found myself talking to her, trying to comfort her, promising to help her find her family. She stayed with me for over 100 miles, chatting about her home, her school, her pets, providing details that were far too complex and consistent to be simple hallucinations. The conversation ended abruptly when I stopped for fuel in Nashville. I turned to tell the little girl that I was going to find a police officer to help her. but the passenger seat was empty. She'd vanished as suddenly as she'd appeared, leaving no trace that she'd ever been there except for the memory of our conversation and a lingering sense that I'd somehow failed to help someone who desperately needed assistance. By the time I reached Georgia, I was barely functional. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly steer. My vision was blurry, and I was nodding off for seconds at a time while driving. I knew I was going to kill someone if I continued. But I was less than 4 hours from the delivery destination and couldn't bring myself to quit when I was so close to completing the run. That's when I saw the accident that changed everything. A multi-vehicle pileup blocking both lanes of I-75, emergency vehicles everywhere, injured people lying on the pavement while paramedics worked to save them. I pulled over and ran toward the scene to offer whatever help I could provide. But when I got there, nothing was damaged. The cars were all upright and undamaged. The people I'd thought were injured were standing around looking confused, and there were no emergency responders anywhere. One of the other drivers approached me and asked if I was okay. "You came running over here yelling about an accident," he said. "Started trying to perform CPR on my truck. Are you having some kind of medical emergency?" That's when I realized how far gone I was. I'd been hallucinating so vividly that I'd actually tried to give medical aid to an inanimate object. I was completely detached from reality, dangerous to everyone around me, and probably minutes away from causing a real accident that would hurt or kill innocent people. I called my dispatcher and told him I couldn't complete the delivery. He was furious, threatened to sue me for breach of contract, said I'd never work for his company again. But I didn't care anymore. I drove to the nearest truck stop, parked in the back of the lot, and slept for 14 straight hours. When I woke up, the world looked different. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds were clearer, and for the first time in 3 days, I could think clearly enough to understand what I'd put myself through. I'd pushed my body and mind so far beyond their limits that I'd lost the ability to distinguish between reality and hallucination. I'd become a danger to everyone on the road, including myself. I completed the delivery a day late after getting proper rest and medical clearance from a doctor who confirmed that I was suffering from severe sleep deprivation and stimulant abuse. The customer was understanding. The medical equipment reached its destination safely, and I got paid enough to cover my mom's treatment costs for that month. But the experience changed how I approached this job. I never again accepted loads with impossible deadlines. Never again drove beyond my physical limits for any amount of money. Because I learned that some costs are too high to pay, even when you're desperate. And the cost of losing your grip on reality, even temporarily, is higher than any paycheck could ever be worth. The hallucinations stopped after I got proper rest, but I'll never forget how real they seemed at the time. The little girl in my passenger seat, the government surveillance team, the accidents that existed only in my exhausted mind. They were as vivid and convincing as any real experience I've ever had. And that's the most frightening part of sleep deprivation. It doesn't just make you tired, it makes you unable to trust your own perceptions of the world around you. My name is Saint, and I've been driving these highways since 1989. Back when I started, CB radios weren't just communication tools. They were lifelines that connected drivers across thousands of miles of lonely road. Channel 19 was like a rolling community where you'd recognize voices, make friends you'd never meet face to face, and share information that could save your life or your livelihood. Those were different times, when truckers looked out for each other, and the CB chatter helped pass the miles during long nights on empty highways. I've always been old school about CB protocol. I know the proper channels for different types of communication: remember the 10 codes that most younger drivers have forgotten, and maintain relationships with other veteran drivers who've been on these roads as long as I have. Over the years, I've heard thousands of voices come and go. Drivers who retired, changed careers, or simply faded away from the routes I traveled. But some voices you never forget, especially when they start calling you from beyond the grave. It started about 2 years ago on a run from Phoenix to Denver. I was hauling electronics, nothing special, just trying to make good time on a route I'd driven hundreds of times before. It was around 3 a.m., that dead hour when most of the country is sleeping, and the highways belong to truckers and long-distance travelers. I had my CB tuned to channel 19, listening to the sparse chatter from other drivers scattered across the western states. That's when I heard a familiar voice calling my handle. "Saint, you got your ears on? This is Wolfpack, westbound on I-40. Come back to me, old friend." I nearly dropped my coffee. Wolfpack was Danny Rodriguez, a driver I'd known for 15 years. We'd run similar routes throughout the Southwest, often encountered each other at truck stops and loading docks, shared countless conversations during late-night drives through the desert. Danny was good people, reliable, honest, always willing to help another driver in trouble. But Danny had been dead for 8 months, killed in a rollover accident outside Flagstaff when his brakes failed on a mountain grade. I keyed up my mic, thinking maybe someone was using Danny's old handle without knowing its history. "This is Saint. Who am I talking to?" "Come on, Saint, you know my voice." The response came back immediately. "It's Danny. Wolfpack. Remember that time we got snowed in at the truck stop in Amarillo? Played poker until dawn while waiting for the plows to clear I-40? The memory was accurate and specific, not something that would be common knowledge among drivers who didn't know Danny personally. We had been stranded together during a blizzard 3 years earlier, along with maybe a dozen other drivers. But the poker game had been just the two of us, killing time in the driver's lounge while everyone else slept. "Danny's dead," I said into the mic. "Died last spring in Arizona. Whoever this is, it's not funny." "I know I'm dead, Saint," the voice replied. And now I could hear the sadness in it that I'd missed before. "But I'm still here, still trying to look out for my brothers on the road. Got something important to tell you about your route tonight." I was shaking as I held the mic. The voice was definitely Danny's. Same accent, same speech patterns, same way of drawing out certain words that I'd heard thousands of times over the years. But Danny Rodriguez was buried in a cemetery in Tucson. I'd attended his funeral, watched them lower his coffin into the ground. "What do you want to tell me?" I asked, not sure if I was losing my mind or experiencing something that couldn't be explained by rational thinking. "There's trouble ahead at mile marker 247, Danny's voice said. "Drunk driver heading eastbound in the westbound lanes. Police know about it, but haven't got him stopped yet. You're about 10 minutes out from there. Take the next exit and wait until they get it cleared up." I looked at my GPS. Mile marker 247 was indeed about 10 minutes ahead at my current speed. Taking the exit Danny mentioned would add maybe 20 minutes to my trip. But if he was right about the wrong-way driver, those 20 minutes could save my life. "How do you know this?" I asked. "I know a lot of things now that I couldn't see when I was alive," Danny replied. "Time works different here. I can see what's coming, what's happened, what needs to be changed. Trust me on this one, Saint. Take the exit." I took the exit. 20 minutes later, I was back on I-40 when I heard the Smokey Bears on Channel 9 reporting that they'd successfully stopped a wrong-way driver at mile marker 247. The drunk had been heading east in the westbound lanes for over 30 miles before police managed to force him off the road. If I'd maintained my original schedule, I would have met him head-on at highway speed. That should have been the end of it? A strange experience that maybe saved my life. Something to file away under unexplained but beneficial. But Danny's voice started appearing regularly on my CB radio, always late at night, always with information that proved to be accurate and important. He warned me about a bridge washout in New Mexico 2 weeks before it happened. He told me to avoid a truck stop in Oklahoma where an armed robbery was about to take place. He provided alternate routes around accidents and construction delays that hadn't been reported yet on traffic services. Every piece of information he gave me was correct, and following his advice consistently kept me out of dangerous or costly situations. But it wasn't just practical information. Danny would also talk about what it was like being dead, what he could see from wherever he was, and why he was able to communicate through CB radio when other methods seemed impossible. CB radio works on different frequencies than cell phones or internet, he explained during one of our conversations. The electromagnetic spectrum touches places you can't imagine, Saint. When you broadcast on these channels, the signal doesn't just reach other truckers, it reaches spaces between spaces, times between times. That's how I can talk to you. I started looking forward to these conversations, partly because Danny's information was so valuable, but mostly because I missed my old friend and was grateful for any opportunity to talk with him again. He told me about other drivers he'd encountered in whatever realm he now inhabited. Guys who died on the highways over the decades. Some from accidents, others from heart attacks or other natural causes while on the road. There's a whole community of us, Danny said. Drivers who loved this life so much that death couldn't completely separate us from the highway. We try to look out for the living, help when we can, pass along information that might save lives or prevent tragedies. The conversations weren't always comforting. Danny also described the darker side of death on the highways. Drivers who died violently or tragically and couldn't find peace. Accidents that kept replaying in endless loops. And malevolent presences that fed on the fear and loneliness that truckers experience during long, isolated runs. Not everyone who dies on these roads becomes a helper, he warned me during one particularly disturbing conversation. Some get twisted by the trauma of their death, become something dangerous. If you ever hear voices on the CB that feel wrong, that try to get you to do things that don't make sense, don't listen. Get off that channel and stay away. As months passed, other drivers started mentioning similar experiences. Veteran truckers would quietly discuss voices they'd heard on the CB. Deceased drivers they'd known, warnings that had saved their lives, information that couldn't have come from living sources. It became an informal network of communication between the living and the dead, with CB radio serving as the bridge between worlds. But the most important conversation I had with Danny came almost exactly 1 year after our first contact. I was running late on a delivery to Salt Lake City, pushing hard to make up time lost to a mechanical breakdown in Nevada. Danny's voice came through my CB at around midnight, more urgent than I'd ever heard him before. "Saint, you need to pull over right now," he said. "Don't ask questions. Don't wait for a better place to stop. Pull over immediately and shut down your engine." I was on a stretch of highway with no obvious place to stop safely, but something in Danny's tone convinced me not to argue. I pulled onto the narrow shoulder and shut down, wondering what emergency he'd seen coming that I couldn't detect. 5 minutes later, my engine block cracked. A catastrophic failure that would have left me stranded in the middle of traffic if it had happened while I was moving. The truck was totaled, but I walked away without injury because Danny had warned me to stop before the failure occurred. "How did you know?" I asked him over the CB after the tow truck had loaded my rig. "I could see the stress fractures developing in the metal," Danny replied. From where I am now, I can see the structural integrity of things, the weak points that are about to fail. Your engine had maybe minutes left before complete failure. If you'd been driving when it happened, especially at the speed you were going, it would have been catastrophic. That was the last time I heard Danny's voice on the CB radio. Other drivers told me similar stories, ghostly contacts that provided crucial help during times of crisis, then faded away once their purpose had been fulfilled. Some theorized that the dead can only maintain contact with the living for limited periods, that the energy required to communicate across that divide eventually exhausts itself. I still listen for Danny's voice during long nights on empty highways, still hope to hear that familiar greeting on Channel 19. But the radio stays silent except for the voices of living drivers sharing information about traffic, weather, and road conditions. Sometimes that's enough, knowing that the community of truckers extends beyond death, that drivers who've gone before are still watching out for those of us who continue rolling down these endless highways. The CB radio sits next to me as I drive, a connection to both the living and the dead, a reminder that some friendships survive even the ultimate journey. And every time I key up that mic, every time I broadcast on Channel 19, I remember that my voice is traveling farther than I can imagine, reaching places and people that exist beyond the physical world I can see. My name is Romeo, and I've been driving commercial trucks for 19 years without a single violation on my record. I'm what other drivers call a by-the-book guy. I follow every regulation, maintain my equipment religiously, keep my logbooks perfect, and never take shortcuts that might compromise safety or legality. That reputation for reliability has served me well in this business, earning me steady work with reputable companies and the respect of DOT officers who know they won't find problems when they inspect my rig. But being careful and following rules couldn't protect me from what happened at a way station in Wyoming last October. Sometimes the system itself becomes corrupted, and all your compliance and preparation means nothing when you encounter people who use their authority for purposes that have nothing to do with highway safety or commercial vehicle regulation. I was hauling computer components from Portland to Chicago, a routine run I'd made dozens of times before. The load was properly secured, my paperwork was in order, and my truck was mechanically sound. I'd pre-tripped everything twice and knew there wouldn't be any issues if I got selected for inspection. When I saw the way station sign outside Laramie, I didn't even consider bypassing it. My gross weight was legal, my log was current, and I had nothing to hide. The station appeared normal when I pulled in. Standard layout with scales, inspection bays, and a small office building where DOT officers processed paperwork and conducted business. There were maybe half a dozen other trucks going through the weighing process, and everything seemed routine. I rolled onto the scales, transmitted my weight reading, and waited for the green light that would allow me to continue on my route. Instead, I got the red light and a voice over the loudspeaker directing me to Inspection Bay 3 for a Level 1 inspection. That wasn't unusual. I got randomly selected for detailed inspections maybe once every few months, and they'd never found anything wrong with my equipment or documentation. I pulled into the designated bay and shut down my engine, expecting the standard procedure of checking brakes, lights, tires, and securement systems. The DOT officer who approached my truck looked professional enough. Clean uniform, proper badge, clipboard with inspection forms. But something about his demeanor seemed off from the beginning. Instead of the businesslike efficiency I was used to from commercial vehicle inspectors, this guy seemed nervous and kept glancing back toward the office building like he was waiting for instructions. "License, medical card, and logbook," he said, which was standard procedure. I handed over my documents, all of which were current and properly maintained. He examined them for much longer than necessary, comparing information against something on his clipboard that he wouldn't let me see. "What's your cargo?" he asked. "Computer components," I replied. "Motherboards, processors, that kind of thing. Bill of lading is right there with the other paperwork." He looked at the bill of lading but didn't seem satisfied with the information it contained. "I need to inspect your trailer," he said. "Pop the doors and stand back while I examine the load." This was still within normal inspection protocol, so I unlocked the trailer doors and stepped aside. But instead of the visual inspection I expected, the officer began pulling boxes from my carefully arranged cargo, opening containers that were clearly marked with manufacturer seals and serial numbers. "Hold on," I said. "Those are sealed units from the shipper. Breaking those seals could void warranties and cause problems with my delivery. I have authority to inspect any cargo I deem suspicious," the officer replied. But he wouldn't make eye contact when he said it. "Step back and let me do my job." I watched him open box after box, examining computer components that were obviously legitimate commercial electronics. But he wasn't just looking. He was removing items from their protective packaging, setting them aside in a separate pile, and making notes on his clipboard that had nothing to do with standard inspection procedures. "What exactly are you looking for?" I asked. "Contraband," he said. "Drugs, weapons, illegal substances. You'd be surprised what we find hidden in legitimate cargo." But his search pattern didn't make sense for contraband detection. He was specifically targeting the most expensive items: high-end processors, graphics cards, memory modules, while ignoring boxes that would have been better hiding places for illegal materials. It looked more like he was conducting an inventory than a safety inspection. After about an hour of this, another officer emerged from the building and approached my truck. This one was older, clearly senior in rank, and he had the confident air of someone accustomed to being in charge. But when he looked at me, I saw something in his eyes that made my blood run cold. Calculation. Like he was evaluating me for something that had nothing to do with commercial vehicle compliance. "Romeo Martinez," he said, reading from my license. "Independent contractor hauling for Tech Logistics Corp. Chicago delivery scheduled for tomorrow morning." "That's right," I said. "Is there a problem with my load or documentation?" "Depends," the senior officer replied. "We've had reports of stolen merchandise moving through this corridor. Computer equipment that's been reported missing from various distribution centers. Your cargo matches some descriptions we've received." I knew this was impossible. I'd picked up the load directly from the manufacturer's facility in Portland, with proper bills of lading signed by their shipping manager. Every item was legitimate, properly documented, and covered by insurance. But I also understood that arguing with DOT officers during an inspection was a losing proposition. "All my paperwork is in order," I said. "The shipper can verify every item in that trailer." "We'll verify that," the senior officer said. "But first, we need to impound this cargo as potential evidence. You'll be free to go once we complete our investigation." That's when I realized what was happening. This wasn't a legitimate inspection. It was a seizure operation disguised as routine enforcement. They were planning to confiscate my cargo under the pretense of investigating theft, probably reselling the valuable electronics through channels that would be impossible to trace. "I want to call my company's legal department," I said. "No phone calls until we complete our investigation," the senior officer replied. "Security protocol for potential criminal matters." I looked around the way station and noticed details that had escaped my attention before. There were no other trucks in the inspection bays, despite the fact that several had been randomly selected when I arrived. The scale house appeared to be empty except for the 2 officers I was dealing with. Most significantly, I couldn't see any official DOT vehicles. Just a couple of unmarked pickup trucks parked behind the building. "I need to see your supervisor," I said. "I am the supervisor," the senior officer replied. "And I'm telling you that this cargo is being seized pending investigation. You can cooperate and walk away, or you can make this difficult and face charges for interfering with a federal investigation." I knew they were bluffing about federal charges, but I also knew I was in a vulnerable position. I was alone at an isolated way station with two armed men who were clearly operating outside legitimate authority. My truck was loaded with valuable cargo that could be easily resold, and there were no witnesses to whatever they decided to do. That's when I made the decision that probably saved my life. Instead of continuing to argue or demand to see documentation of their authority, I pretended to accept their explanation and asked what I needed to do to complete the process quickly. "Smart choice," the senior officer said. "We'll inventory everything, give you a receipt for the seized items, and you can be on your way. Shouldn't take more than a couple hours." But I wasn't planning to wait around for them to finish stealing my cargo. While they were focused on unloading expensive electronics from my trailer, I quietly retrieved my cell phone from the cab and moved to a position where I could get a clear signal. Instead of calling my company's legal department, I called 911 and reported an armed robbery in progress at the way station. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 10 minutes, the way station was surrounded by state police vehicles and genuine DOT enforcement officers. The two men who had been inspecting my cargo tried to claim they were conducting a legitimate investigation, but they couldn't produce proper identification or documentation of their authority. It turned out they weren't DOT officers at all, just criminals who had set up an operation to steal cargo from trucks by impersonating federal inspectors. The way station had been closed for maintenance, which they'd used as an opportunity to establish their fake inspection setup. They'd been operating for weeks, seizing valuable cargo from drivers who were too intimidated or confused to question their authority. The investigation revealed that they'd stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of merchandise using this method, targeting independent drivers who were less likely to have corporate legal resources to fight back. My load was the largest single seizure they'd attempted, which probably would have been their last operation before disappearing with enough money to retire. I got my cargo back and completed my delivery on schedule. But the experience changed how I approach way stations and DOT inspections. I now verify the legitimacy of any enforcement action that seems unusual, ask for supervisor contact information, and insist on proper documentation of any cargo seizure or extended detention. The scariest part wasn't the attempted theft. It was realizing how easily legitimate authority can be impersonated by people with criminal intentions. These men had uniforms, badges, official-looking paperwork, and complete confidence in their ability to intimidate drivers into compliance. If I hadn't noticed the inconsistencies in their behavior and the suspicious circumstances of the inspection, they would have successfully stolen my entire load and probably gotten away with it. Now, when I encounter DOT officers or other enforcement personnel, I'm respectful but cautious. I comply with legitimate requests, but pay attention to details that might indicate something isn't right. Because I learned that the most dangerous criminals aren't always the ones who rob you at gunpoint. Sometimes they're the ones who rob you with clipboards and badges, using your respect for authority against you. My name is Kenneth, and after 43 years of driving these highways, I'm finally hanging up my keys. Tomorrow morning, I'll deliver my final load, park this old Peterbilt for the last time, and transition into a retirement I've been both anticipating and dreading for years. This business has been my entire adult life. I got my CDL when I was 19 fresh out of high school with no clear direction except an understanding that I needed to make a living and support the family I hoped to build someday. The final run seemed fitting when my dispatcher offered it to me. A load of furniture from a factory in North Carolina to a distribution center in Phoenix. The same route I'd driven on my very first solo trip back in 1981. It felt like completing a circle, ending where I began, carrying the same type of cargo over roads that had become as familiar as my own backyard. I figured it would be a nostalgic journey, a chance to reflect on 4 decades of memories and prepare mentally for whatever came next in my life. But from the moment I pulled out of the loading dock in Charlotte, something felt wrong about this trip. The roads looked different than they had just weeks earlier during my previous runs through this territory. Familiar landmarks were missing or relocated. Exit numbers didn't match my GPS or my decades of experience. And the highway itself seemed to follow a path that didn't align with my memories of this route. At first, I attributed the confusion to normal road construction and improvement projects. Highways get rebuilt, signs get updated, and GPS systems sometimes lag behind infrastructure changes. But as I drove deeper into South Carolina and Georgia, the discrepancies became impossible to explain through routine maintenance. Entire cities that should have been visible from the interstate were nowhere to be found, while small towns I'd never heard of appeared where major metropolitan areas should have been located. I stopped at a truck stop outside Atlanta to check my maps and GPS systems, thinking maybe I'd made a wrong turn somewhere and gotten off my intended route. But according to every navigation system I had, I was exactly where I was supposed to be on Interstate 20 westbound. The truck stop itself looked familiar, but the staff were people I'd never seen before. Despite the fact that I'd been stopping at that location for 20 years and knew most of the regular employees by name. "Excuse me," I said to the clerk behind the counter. "Wasn't there a restaurant attached to this building and a repair shop out back?" The young woman looked at me like I was confused. "No, sir. It's always been just the convenience store and fuel pumps. Never had a restaurant or repair facility here." But I remembered eating countless meals at the restaurant that should have been attached to this building, getting minor repairs done at the shop that should have been behind the fuel islands. I'd celebrated my 50th birthday at a table by the window 3 years earlier, surrounded by other drivers who become friends over the decades of crossing paths at various stops along this route. I tried calling some of those friends to see if they'd noticed anything unusual about the roads lately, but every number I dialed was disconnected or answered by strangers who claimed to have had those phone numbers for years. When I asked dispatchers at trucking companies where some of my old road buddies had worked, they told me no drivers by those names had ever been employed there. By the time I reached Alabama, I was starting to panic. The highway signs were wrong, the mile markers didn't align with my logbooks from previous trips, and every attempt to contact people from my professional past led to dead ends and blank stares. It was like my 43 years in this industry had been erased, leaving me driving through a landscape that resembled the routes I knew, but contained none of the people, places, or memories that had given those routes meaning. The really disturbing realization came when I stopped at a way station outside Birmingham. I'd been through that facility hundreds of times over the years, knew most of the DOT officers by name, had even attended the retirement party for the station supervisor 5 years earlier. But when I pulled up to the scale house, the officer who processed my paperwork looked at my license and logbooks with confusion. "These records show you've been driving commercial vehicles since 1981, he said. "But our database doesn't have any history for your license number before last month. Are you sure this information is accurate?" I showed him logbooks going back decades, awards for safe driving, letters of recommendation from employers, photographs of trucks I'd owned and operated over the years. But none of it seemed to register in any official database. According to every computer system he accessed, I'd only been a commercial driver for a few weeks, with no previous history of employment, violations, or inspections. Must be some kind of database error, the officer said. But he looked troubled by the discrepancy. You might want to contact the DMV to get your records straightened out. I tried calling the DMV from the parking lot. But when I provided my license number and personal information, they told me the same thing. No record of commercial driving experience before the current month. When I asked about the companies I'd worked for over the decades, some had never existed and others had no record of ever employing me. As I continued west toward Mississippi, I started encountering other disturbing inconsistencies. The radio stations were wrong. Classic rock stations were playing music I'd never heard before. News programs were discussing events that didn't match my memories of recent history. And even the advertising was for products and companies that seemed unfamiliar, despite being described as household names. I pulled into a truck stop outside Jackson and tried to use the internet to research what was happening to me. But when I searched for trucking companies I'd worked for, routes I'd driven, even major industry events I'd participated in, the results didn't match my memories. It was like I was living in a parallel version of the world where everything was similar but subtly different, where my entire professional history had been rewritten or erased. The most frightening discovery came when I tried to call my ex-wife to tell her about the strange experiences I was having. We'd divorced 15 years earlier, but remained on good terms, especially since she was the mother of my 2 children and grandmother to my 4 grandkids. But the phone number I'd been calling for 20 years was disconnected. And when I contacted directory assistants, they told me no one by her name had ever lived at the address where I'd sent child support payments for years. I drove to the house where she lived, a small ranch home in a suburb of Memphis that I'd visited countless times to pick up and drop off our kids during their childhood. But the house was occupied by a family I'd never seen before, people who claimed to have lived there for over a decade. When I described my ex-wife and showed them pictures from my wallet, they looked at me with genuine sympathy and suggested I might need medical attention. By the time I reached Arkansas, I was beginning to understand what was happening. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity or database errors. This was something far more disturbing. A systematic erasure of my existence as a truck driver, my relationships, my entire adult life. Every mile I drove toward Phoenix was taking me further away from the world I'd known and deeper into a reality where Kenneth Martinez, the trucker, had never existed. I started seeing manifestations of my past along the highway. Trucks I'd owned and operated over the years, driving alongside me like ghostly escorts. I saw the 1985 Freightliner I'd bought when I first went independent, the Kenworth I'd driven for 10 years hauling steel across the Midwest, the Peterbilt I'd customized with chrome and custom paint that had been my pride and joy during the 1990s. All of them were occupied by younger versions of myself, drivers from different decades of my career, watching me with expressions of loss and regret. The conversations with these phantom drivers were the most disturbing part of the entire journey. They spoke to me through CB radio, using handles I'd forgotten, sharing memories of loads we'd hauled, roads we'd traveled, people we'd met along the way. But they also warned me about what waited at the end of this final run. "You can't retire, Kenneth," my 40-year-old self told me from the cab of that old Kenworth. "The road won't let you go. You've given it too much of your life, spent too many years belonging to the highway instead of to people and places. Now it owns you completely." I reached Phoenix exactly on schedule, despite all the detours and delays caused by trying to understand what was happening to me. The delivery went smoothly. The warehouse received the furniture, signed the paperwork, and processed the transaction like any normal business delivery. But when I tried to contact my dispatcher to report completion of the run, his phone number was disconnected. The trucking company that had employed me for the past 8 years no longer existed. The building where their offices had been located was occupied by a completely different business, and no one there had ever heard of the company or the people I'd worked with. Even my truck, the Peterbilt that had been my home and workplace for so many years, seemed different. Older, more worn, like it had aged decades during the course of this single run. I'm writing this from a truck stop outside Phoenix, sitting in a cab that no longer feels familiar, trying to process the realization that my retirement isn't a choice I'm making, but a transition that's being forced on me by powers I don't understand. The highway has taken everything: my history, my relationships, my identity as a professional driver, and left me with nothing but memories that apparently exist only in my own mind. Tomorrow I'll try to drive home, but I suspect that home no longer exists either. The house I own, the bank accounts I've built up, the retirement plans I've made, all of it is probably gone. Erased along with everything else that connected Kenneth Martinez to the trucking industry. The road giveth, and the road taketh away. And after 43 years of faithful service, I'm learning that some careers don't end with gold watches and retirement parties. They end with the realization that you never really owned your life at all. The highway owned it. And when it's finished with you, it erases every trace that you were ever here. That's the price of loving the road too much, of giving it everything you had and expecting to walk away intact when you were ready to quit. The last run never really ends for drivers like me. It just continues forever, carrying loads through a world where we exist but don't belong, where we're always traveling but never really arriving anywhere that matters. If you enjoyed these disturbing trucker horror stories, make sure to subscribe to Verified Fears for more terrifying true encounters from the road.